Okay, now I'm starting again with a recording. I'm going to share my screen and go here to
I'm not sure if it's recording because usually something pops up that says,
did
it's
it not
recording.
pop up?
But maybe because you already started it, it won't do that. I'm not sure.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you for telling me that. Let's make sure. Okay.
I did hear it say recording in progress.
And it shows the little red recording light flashing in the corner.
It does.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it does.
It
I
does.
see it.
Okay. So we're good, you think? Y'all think we are recording?
I think
Yes.
so.
Yes.
Okay. All right. But it didn't pop up and say you're recording this session, did it? Just now. It did a while ago, but then when I lost my connection, it said, it was ready to process that recording. It stopped recording. So I felt like I needed to start it again. All right. Tina, this is when I went to the choice assignment under, I think it's under this week. It just shows up. If you try to download that document, it's not downloading. It's downloading like a text document. And I can't figure out why. But just in the space below that, you can see the whole document here and the rubric that goes with it. Did y'all all see that?
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to go to the next page. So the
Okay.
first page, when you click on it, it says like you don't have permission, but then the next page, it'll actually show the screen that you're on.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
And then the same is true with the next page after that. There's choice B. And it's printed right there. Okay. Choice B. So go to choice A and B and look at them and decide which one you want to focus on. And I think that's due next week. Am I right about that? It's not due this week, is it? I think it's next week.
I think he said if we can tell you by July 1st,
Yeah.
something about 10 points.
Yeah, that's right. And I've had a couple of people already let me know. And July 1st is what, Friday?
Coming up.
Yeah, I think that's Friday.
That'll be
Yeah,
before
this is the
that.
29th. So shoot me an email before then. I've already got a couple, but you get those extra points if you go ahead and let me know. Okay. And if you've got questions about the assignment itself, just send me an email or give me a call. And next week is the week that I'm with my mom. And so I will just be hanging out, watching a lot of daytime TV. So y'all just give me a call or send me a message and I'll be happy to talk with you. Next week's the week I'll be coming to you from over there. So I'm going to close that screen now, stop sharing since I've showed you where that is. And just go back to our full screen view here. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the chapters that we had this week, 7, 8, and 9. And they're pretty dense chapters. I want to try to help you out a little bit with your quiz by just talking about some of the questions that will be on the quiz. It's not, I've had a couple of people tell me that they're having a hard time getting through the quiz. And so maybe if you've got a little bit of a heads up on some of the questions, you'll be able to get through it a little faster and not feel that anxiety of the clock is ticking quite so much. So let's just talk a little bit about some of the points that you had in your reading guide this week. You've got a reading guide that walks you basically through chapters 7, 8, and 9. And so it's very much linked with the quiz. And so if you go through the reading guide, and like I say, it's basically just it's a walk through those 3 chapters. And I reviewed myself on those 3 chapters by using the reading guide as my reminder of what's in those chapters. And the first one of those is a really rich chapter about how we instruct students with significant disabilities. And I don't know if any of you on the screen right now, I don't remember if any of you have been teachers of students with significant disabilities. Do I have anybody on the screen right now who's had that experience? Okay, Rhonda has. But it takes a whole different kind of teaching than typical teaching, particularly general ed teachings. We have a few of those procedures that we use with special ed. But when you talk about students who have a very low level of intellectual functioning, we're talking about a whole different kind of teaching. And I think that chapter 7 really lends itself to understanding that population really well when it goes through all the different types of methodologies that you need to have in your toolbox for teaching that population. Now, a number of you on the screen are planning to be educational diagnosticians, and you won't be teaching these individuals. Those of you who are not planning on being diagnosticians may not ever plan on teaching these individuals. But when you have a number of special ed courses in your toolbox, you'll be equipped to help people who are teaching those populations, and you can guide them in their instruction, in preparing their IEPs, in teaching their classes. As I've talked a couple of times in the last few weeks, your focus as you get a master's degree needs to be on that next level of employment, whether you're planning to be a diagnostician or some level of master teacher or a supervisor or a coordinator or whatever you want your job to be in the future. You need to be thinking beyond just the level of a, I hate to say regular teacher, but I can't think of a better word, of a typical teacher, because a master's level teacher is, or a master's level educator is on a different plane. You've got more information in your toolbox. You've got another set of skills that the bachelor's level teacher doesn't have, or the bachelor's level educator. And so you're bringing a different set of skills and information and experiences to the table because you've been exposed to a master's level setting of learning. So I really like students in this class, particularly, many of whom are not planning to be in our diagnostician program, but are planning to be educators at some other level, to be thinking about what they're going to offer the educational environment with this set of skills. So thinking at that next plane, what am I going to offer somebody who is teaching a group of students who have significant disabilities? What am I, as a master's degree holding educator, what am I going to be able to offer that person if I'm not the teacher of record? What can I offer? Now, as educational diagnosticians, you're going to be helping those people from that diagnostic perspective. You're going to be the one evaluating that student. You're going to be the one helping that person who's the teacher to perhaps construct the IEP, to know where levels of true weakness are. And then maybe even if the teacher is very new to the profession, and some of you may know that oftentimes the newest teachers in the profession are placed in those classrooms. And I don't know why we put the newest teachers in the most difficult classrooms, but we do. It's a very poor practice, but we do it anyway. We put the newbies in the hardest places, and then of course they leave because the challenge was often too great and they didn't have the skills for it. But we run a lot of young teachers off that way. But we want to empower those people who do have those classes with the skills that they need, and they may not have gotten that in a university setting. And of course, you all know, and some of you may be these people who step into classrooms without a university degree in education. Many of our teachers, of course, you all know, are coming from alternative certification avenues. And so they haven't had the benefit of university training. And so this may be the training that you're getting, may be the only opportunity they have to see what a life skills teacher needs to know. So let's talk a little bit about what we see in chapter 7. Your reading guide says that you need to know the various categories of behaviors that are targeted by various learning objectives. And then it gives you a couple of examples there. Well, there are 4 types of learning objectives. And then we need to know what those are. The first one is the first one that's mentioned there in the parentheses. And it's simple or discrete. The second one is the second one that's mentioned there, and that's continuous or ongoing. And then we have complex and or chained. And then we have the fourth one, which is functional routines. And those are all listed in your textbook pretty close to the beginning of chapter 7. It talks at great length about objectives and how some are linked to curriculum and others are functional in nature. And as you all probably know at this point in this course, most of the objectives, many of the objectives, and I would dare say probably most of the objectives that we have for our students with significant cognitive disabilities are functional in nature, because of the fact that academics are, or at least, I would say academics are out of reach of many of the students that we have in classrooms for students with significant disabilities. They may be working on pre-academics or functional academics, but typical grade level academics are going to be out of reach for most students with this designation, or they wouldn't have this designation. So we have to think about things in a bit different, with a different mindset. And what's going to be the set of objectives that are most useful to these students. And there's a term that it comes in a little bit later down here on this this page. And this is a question on your quiz this week about social validity. And I'm not sure that the term social validity is actually mentioned in your chapters anywhere, but social validity is simply the level of meaning or value that that the work or the objectives or the IEP or whatever it is we're looking at has to the person who's actually involved in it or executing it. And so I think there's a question on your quiz that says, how important is that to what a teacher determines is going to be taught to a student? I think it's a true or false question. Should the teacher be concerned about social validity? And what do you think? Yes, true. And the answer to that is true. The teacher should be concerned about teaching things that are socially valid or have social validity to the student or the student's family, ultimately to the student, whether the student can express that or not. But if something isn't socially valid to the student, then it's not worthwhile for the student to expend any energy on it. And so social validity is of importance to students and what they're going to be learning. I think that we see this a lot, and this isn't described exactly in your textbook, but you all may have observed this in schools where you are. Maybe you'll go into a classroom and you'll see a student with a low level of academic ability. And maybe I've seen this countless times in my lengthy career. Maybe the student is coloring or something like that. To me, it's a pretty low level skill. And I ask myself, where is the value of that in this student's life or in the real world? You know, extrapolate that out, and where would I find the student doing this in life, in the real world? And I can't think of a place or an opportunity where it would have any meaning outside of that classroom. And I'm thinking, okay, is this just convenient for the teacher to give the child a coloring sheet, when they're in the 7th grade or the 9th grade or whatever it might be? If it's not socially appropriate for the student at that age, is it just convenient for a teacher to give a student a coloring sheet? What's the educational value in that? And I've struggled to find what it is. I haven't been able to determine it. And so I would say that's an example of the social validity of a task. If the teacher can't say to you, here's why this is really valuable to the student, then that's not a good objective. That's not a good activity for the student to be spending time on. It needs to be an activity that has meaning. And so there's a good description in your book about each one of those types of objectives and why we would want the student to target those in their activities at school. A discrete objectives is just one that's very simple and unique. Not a lot of variability. It's one thing that we're going to look at. A continuous ongoing objective has more depth and meaning. The complex chained objective has more steps and has multiple individual components. And then the functional routine is something that has context. It may be very much like the complex chained objectives, but it has meaning. I think there's an example in your book about making a sandwich, but it wouldn't just be like making a sandwich in isolation. It would be that the student is hungry and they say, I'm hungry. What do I need to do when I'm hungry? I need to make a sandwich. And so it's putting that task in context. And so that would be a functional routine. So your book gives some great examples of each one of these very early in chapter 7. At the top of page 125 is also a really great description of a behavioral objective and all the components that are needed in a behavioral objective. And as I said a few minutes ago, I see each of you as educational leaders in your schools. And so I would think that description of a behavioral objective at the top of page 125 would be something that you could use to take into your schools and describe a behavioral objective to your teachers and say, hey, this is what a behavioral objective needs to look like. So when you start writing your IEPs, use this as a guide. I think there's another question on your quiz about, are objectives, really necessary for every kind of activity that a student has? And the answer to that, is yes. A couple of those true, false are kind of gimmies. The next thing on your reading guide is about the difference between form and function of a behavior. And this is an important thing for all teachers to know, but particularly teachers or those who work with students with significant disabilities. And that is, function is always more important than form. Function overrides form, no matter what. And we think about that in practical terms when we think about students with significant disabilities. Can y'all hear me still? Okay. we want the activity that the student is working toward to we want the purpose of it to override how they get there. So the form would be how they get there, and the function would be what the purpose of that activity is. So we want that to always override. Let's say they're, getting together with a friend. That's the function of the activity. How they do that could take on a lot of different appearances. And it could be orchestrated by others. It could be something that happens infrequently, frequently. It could happen in a controlled environment, in a very uncontrolled environment. The form is not what's important. It's the function that they're having socialization with another person. That's the key ingredient of that activity. The next one is about the concept of systematic instruction and some of its potential effects. So here we talk about the structure of instruction, the use of prompting, giving students high levels of reinforcement. A lot of that is on page 131 of your textbook. You want to know about various systems of prompting. There's an interesting section there that describes least to most prompts and most to least prompts. And I remember in a previous summer when I taught this course, I think maybe the first time I taught it, I had to really think about that for a while. Least to most and most to least prompts. And what's the difference there? Have any of you had much experience with that? Rhonda, have you had much experience with that in your class? You want to talk about it? You want me to talk about it?
I know that my three boys, we were working with the absolute most prompts, trying to go to just to get down to the very few, but it was a long, difficult process that those three boys never got there. So,
and that's the system that I've always been familiar with, is most prompts to less prompts, most to least. But the book talks about this other system of less to most. So you start out giving no prompts, and then you see how much the student can do with no prompts. And then you gradually add a prompt if they need it. And then you add a more intensive prompt, and then a more intense, a more supportive prompt, and a more supportive prompt, until you end up giving them the most supportive prompt that they need, or
What
more.
would an example of that look like? I'm Gen Ed. I've never experienced any of that stuff.
Let's see. There's a good one listed here. Let me see. Most to least. It's on page 139, where it starts talking about that. At the bottom of 139, it says, use of the most to least prompt model requires that the teacher establish a hierarchy of prompts, just as in the least to most procedure. Wait a minute, most to least. No, most to least. We want least to most. Least to most. That's on 137. Okay, let's see. Suppose that a teacher wants to teach a student to use a drip coffee maker to make coffee. This is at the bottom of 137. The teacher begins by writing a task analysis of the coffee making process, and then it has each of the steps there. Remove the container of coffee from the cupboard, remove the coffee filters from the cupboard, and then over on 138, plug in the coffee maker, remove the filter tray from the coffee, all of the different steps, very discreet, every single little step you would need. And then following that, the teacher determines a least to most hierarchy of prompts. In this case, the teacher uses the following. The first would be no prompts, or completion of the prior step is to serve as the cue to do the next step. Then if the child can't do that, or the student can't do that, then a verbal direction, they'll tell the student what to do. Or a partial physical prompt, that's when they would, reach in and actually show them what the next step would be. So they would have taught this, and then they're going to gradually, pull back and give only as much of a prompt as the student requires. And if they require a prompt, then they'll give them that prompt, but they're not going to give it until the student requires it. Does that make sense? That's the least to most. And what Rhonda was talking about was the most to least, where you start off giving lots of prompts. And that's what the book talks about, is an errorless learning, where you start out giving them so many prompts that they can't make a mistake. So that complete success is what you start with. And then you begin drawing back. But this chapter is very, very rich. And teachers that have not had this training on this type of learning and are trying to teach kids who have significant disabilities really need this. So this is a chapter that if you come across a teacher who finds herself or himself in a life skills class with kids with significant disabilities, and they haven't had any of this kind of training, I would pull this chapter out and share it, because it's rich with how to do some of this prompting. I never had this kind of training when I was starting out my career as a special educator. And I had a class on significant disabilities in my university training years ago, but I didn't have anything this specific about how to do some of these kind of things. And this is very specific. I think this would be a wonderful help to a new teacher starting out in how to actually operationalize some of the steps needed to teach students with significant disabilities. And the same is true of chapter 9, which goes into the measuring of success of some of this. Chapter 9 looks at the evaluation process, the teacher evaluation side of things. Now it talks a little bit about evaluation from a more global perspective, and involving kids with significant disabilities in statewide assessments and things like that. But it talks also about how teachers take data. Now in a couple of weeks, a few weeks, I think on the 20th of July, I'm going to have my daughter Meredith come and talk to us about her experiences as a life skills teacher. And she taught exclusively life skills for 12 years, and she was a whiz at taking data, because in order to be successful at this, you've got to be able to measure the most incremental progress that a student can make. With some students in a life skills class, and the chapter 7 talks about this, with those discrete measures that we mentioned up here at the top of our reading guide, those discrete objectives may be measuring something as I hate to say simple, but as simple as eye gaze. The student may not have oral communication. We may be communicating purely with can they track an object or a finger from center to side like that. And so we may be measuring their success on a particular objective as to whether or not they can track movement. And
I heard one student that's how we did his, was if he was following following us with his eyes. And then I had another student whose he couldn't even follow us with his eyes. So it was all his expression on his face.
Right. So,
That got kind of tricky.
yeah. But it depends. And this is where you really see the individualization of special education, because that student looks a whole lot different from the student sitting next to him. And what works for that student and how you're going to measure his objectives, and his objectives are very different from the child sitting next to him, and how you measure his objectives are very different from how you measure that of the child sitting next to him. So talk about individualization. That type of classroom with this type of student is as individualized as anything you can imagine. And it's tough. You know, there is no, I mean, you could do a few group things, but when you're talking about measuring success on an IEP and progress monitoring is so individualized, you can't do it in a group. You've got to do it one-on-one. So data gathering is discussed in chapter 9. That's the last question on your reading guide, is being familiar with the various forms of behavioral data gathering. So it talks some about event recording and rate recording. It talks about how you need to define the behavior first, and then you observe the behavior, and then you record the data that you observe from the behavior, and then how you can do that. And there's lots of different methods for that. Let's see. There's a question or two on here about what works for kids with autism spectrum disorders and how that might vary. Your textbook has a whole list. They're in chapter 7. There's a chart. I'm not sure what page that's on. It's toward the end. It's on page 150. Things that work for students with autism spectrum disorder. And there's a question very specific to that on your quiz about what things do work. Then I think there's a question, maybe it's a question that says, which of the following does not work? And you've got several things that are listed there in that chart. And then I think there's, I think included in that list is, because this chapter talks about the least to most and most to least, and which one of those is most effective with kids with autism and which one isn't. And that's a question on your quiz. So pay attention to that. Let's see. It asks you about,
Can I just ask something really fast?
sure, you may.
This one that you just went over was still in chapter 7 about the autism.
Yeah, that's at the end of chapter 7.
Okay. Because I did see this one table. It's called 7.1 Established Treatments for Students with ASD. But I don't know if that's the one you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's it. There, it's on page 150. Is that right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
150.
150.
Schedules, story-based intervention package.
Yeah,
And near the top, it says like antecedent behavioral.
yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
And
that's
this
it.
one is going from least to most, or?
That's just a chart that talks about procedures, instructional procedures that work with kids with autism.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah. But in the body of the chapter, it talks about which one of those two things, the most to least and least to most, is more effective with kids with autism. That's not on the chart. That's just embedded in the body of the chapter. There's a section on beginning on 148 that says considerations for teaching students with autism spectrum disorders. Make sure you read that whole section, because it talks about somewhere in there, it says that one of those is more appropriate than the other for kids with autism. Okay. So what about overlearning? Is overlearning a good thing?
I would say yes. Just
Mm, You
but
would be
this-
right.
okay, because I have a few kids in my resource classes that have had lower IQs. That maybe we had to decide, is resource better for them or a life skills classroom? And so with those students, we had to do a lot of repetition. And anytime I think of repetition or overlearning, I think of repetition.
Right. Um, And it's a fact that students with intellectual disabilities have a lot of difficulty with generalization and maintenance of learning. So we want to overlearn. Overlearning is a good thing. We want to learn. Now, we also want to pull, that's one of the questions. And then there's also a question about reinforcement. Now, with all learning, we want to pull back on reinforcement as we learn. So you don't want to continue with the same level of reinforcement. I mean, this is true with when we're teaching our children things, and when we're training our dog to sit. We start off by giving a treat, and then we don't give a treat as often, and then we give no treat at all. The same concept is true with learning in school. But think about when you were learning your multiplication tables in the 3rd grade. Why do you still know your multiplication tables? And I hope that you do. But it was repetition. It was that over learning that helped you still know your multiplication tables today. You practiced and practiced and practiced and overlearned to the point that I hope you still know them today. But you may still struggle with your 8s. I have a little trouble with my 8s, but I learned those many, many years ago, and they've stuck with me. So your book talks too about gestural prompts and verbal prompts. I was going to tell y'all my secret question for this week will be about a gestural prompt that I use with my 2 dogs. And my 2 dogs, and I'm gonna put a bunch of names on my question. But I'll have, let's see, how will I do it? I've got 2 dogs. I've got Molly and Maddie. And I guess I'll just ask you the name of one of them. My old dog is Molly, okay? So I'll just ask you her name. But she is so smart, and she can just do almost anything that I tell her to do. But y'all may have used baby sign language with your kids, but she'll come over and want a treat, and I'll give her a treat. But when I do this, like that, she knows that treats are done, and she'll walk away. I let the dogs go outside to, use the potty, and Molly is losing her hearing. She's 14 now. They're both German Shepherds, and she's losing her hearing. So she'll go outside to use the bathroom, and well, there's not a bathroom out there. It's just the yard, but she'll go out to relieve herself. And after she finishes, she'll go get in the doghouse. And Maddie just goes over to the fence and just barks and barks and barks. And so I'll say, okay, and it's dark outside. Say, come on back in. And Maddie comes running back in. And Molly is deaf and she can't hear me call. And so I say, when Maddie comes back in, I say, okay, you need to go get your friend. And that's all I say. I say, go get your friend. And she'll go back outside in the dark. And I don't know what she says to Molly, but she says something, and she gets her, and they both come back in the house. So that's a smart dog. 2 smart dogs for you right there. But I'm going to ask you the name of my old smart dog, and that's Molly. Okay. I'm going to put 4 names on there in a multiple choice question. And you have to write Molly, and that's the right answer. Okay. Let's see what else. talked about overlearning. We talked about, let's see, we talked about social validity and autism spectrum disorder treatments. What about natural cues to behavior versus instructional cues? If I'm driving, if I'm driving with my husband and we come up to a red light and I say, that light is red, that's an instructional cue on my part. If I just let him see the red light, that's a natural cue. But me telling him is an instructional cue. The red light itself is a natural cue. He sees it, he knows it's red, he stops. But me telling him is an instructional cue. Okay. So if we let the environment give the cue, that's a natural cue. If we give instruction, then that's an instructional cue. What we want to work toward with our students with more significant disabilities is to let natural cues do the job for us and pull back, wean the student from instructional cues and let the natural cues take over. Okay. Questions, comments? Anybody? Jean Ann's
just-
enjoying her dinner?
I wanted to say thank you for giving us a heads up on what's on the quiz so we can kind of, hone in on those. I mean, we'll
Okay.
read everything, but it's kind of nice when you're answering questions that. you can
Well,
kinda-
I would
back.
definitely read all 3 chapters, but I think that 7, well, all 3 of them are good. 7 is really rich though for what you can share with teachers. And if you're, and you may be a teacher of that population yourself someday, but if you're planning to be a diagnostician or a coordinator or a supervisor or maybe a director of special ed yourself someday, this is very rich information that you can use and to help you understand what the teacher in this type of classroom needs to know to be successful. Okay, ladies, you know where you are for this week and next week, what you need to have done. All right. Well, I'm going to say good night to you tonight, and I'll see you next week. Okay.
Good
Have a
night.
happy
Are you
4th of
stopping the
July.
recording?
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording, and then Jean Ann, you and I can visit for a minute. Okay.
Okay, well,
So,
Michelle texted another CRN and that one worked.
oh, okay. So you don't need me.
But I did want to talk about Jill because I missed class that day.
Okay, well, hold on. Let me turn off the recording and then we'll say goodnight to everybody else. And